Hello and welcome to the PC Security channel. This is going to be a podcast style video, so you'll probably be watching some sort of gameplay in the background. But today we're going to take down myths about AV signatures. Now, since that is kind of part of what I do, I realized I should really talk about some of these topics. And this also kind of ties into the question of whether or not we need signatures in this day and age. So the first myth is that signatures cannot detect newer threats. On the surface, this kind of makes sense, like signatures should only be able to detect threats that were created before the time the signature was created. Isn't that why you need regular updates? Well, actually, that is completely false. In fact, signatures can very well detect newer threats in the sense that threats that were created after the signature was published. You might be wondering, how is that possible? Well, that's because signatures aren't exactly like a record of the file or something really unique about the file. They are just like a set of rules, so they can be as generic as required. And there are certain parameters that keep reappearing over and over again in threats. So if you think about a ransomware, for example, almost all ransomware has some identifying characteristics like the ransom node, the encryption method, or deleting shadow copies, using VSSadmin, things like that. And those are the things that are usually taken into account when writing a signature. So even if a new ransomware is created, it is very likely that it is going to match a generic signature for ransomware, even though that signature may be years old by now. So yes, it is totally possible, and it often happens in practice, that signatures detect newer threats. Now, moving on to myth number 2. Some people think that signatures are unique to a file or confuse them with the concept of file hashes. Yes, it is true that you can use something like an MD5 or an SHA-256 to identify malware, and we do that while tracking. But most AV signatures aren't really based on hashes, so they don't have to be unique for each file. One signature may detect thousands and thousands of different malware files. Even if they have different file sizes, different modules, you can pretty much create a generic signature that could, in theory, detect all types of malware. But obviously, in practice, that's a bit more complicated than that. And that takes us to myth number 3, which is signatures are always written after a threat is released. And this is also false. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the time previously written signatures will continue to match threats coming up in the future. But even discounting that, a lot of the time malware analysts and security researchers will find malware in development long before it is actually released into the wild, and they will add signatures at that time. So by the time the threat is finalized and is delivered via its real attack vector, it is probably already profiled, and many AVs may already have signatures for it. So no, signatures aren't always written after a threat is released into the wild. In fact, the opposite is probably more true in most cases. So now that we've cleared some of the misconceptions, let's talk about what constitutes an ideal signature. So in order for a signature to be extremely effective, it has to be generic enough to pick up new malware, but at the same time specific enough to not create too many false positives. So there has to be a balance. If a signature is too generic, then it is going to pick up all sorts of things, including legitimate applications. If a signature is too specific, then it will pick up a very low number of threats. So the detection power of a signature is something like how many threats it can detect without creating too many false positives. Now that we know that, we can talk about whether or not signatures are still necessary. According to my personal experience, I would say that signatures are still very useful in detecting threats. In fact, they do 90% of the work most of the time. Now, don't get me wrong, I still recommend that any solution you use these days should have some sort of behavior monitoring or intrusion prevention module, and I still think that zero-day protection outside of just generic signatures is kind of a necessity. But the funny thing is, like on principle, like how signatures work and how these modules work isn't entirely different. They're just different level implementations of the same idea pretty much. And the efficiency of signatures is something that is very difficult to parallel. You could technically just run a really aggressive HIPS module, but then again, you wouldn't be able to use legitimate applications either, which is what makes signatures kind of the sweet spot for effective computer security. It is also essential to keep in mind that the whole idea of an AV program is that it should be able to identify malware files from the legitimate ones and distinguish between them, which is what would bring me to a rant on whitelisting solutions, but that is a topic for another video. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. Please like it if you did and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the PC Security channel. This is Leo. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay informed, stay secure.